Welcome to Nature Revisited. Nature Revisited is a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we are honored to welcome Beronda Montgomery to the podcast, talking about her new book, When Trees Testify: Science, Wisdom, History, and America's Black Botanical Legacy. Beronda is also the author of the acclaimed book, Lessons from Plants. Beronda is a writer, researcher, and scholar who pursues a common theme of understanding how individuals are impacted by the environments in which they exist. When Trees Testify shares the cultural and personal reclamation of both Black history as well as the Black botanical legacy, which was learned from the stories of long-lived trees. Beronda has received the Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award, Adolph E. Good Jr. Award for Outstanding Science, as well as being named a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University. She is also a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. As an award-winning plant biologist, Beronda explores the ways that 7 trees, as well as the cotton plant, are intertwined with Black history and the Black botanical legacy. As a Black botanist, Beronda brings the wisdom of science and history, along with her personal stories, to life as she introduces us to these majestic trees. Beronda joins me to talk about the importance of when trees testify. So, Beronda, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's an honor having you on the podcast, talking with us about your new book, When Trees Testify. So let's start at the beginning. When did you first learn to listen to trees?
Well, first, I want to just say thank you and how grateful I am to be in conversation. I love that first question because I think it's a little later than I'd like to admit that I first learned to listen to trees. I spent a lot of time with trees when I was young, but it was actually in my early 20s that I would say I first started to listen to trees. And that's when I had decided to study biology. And one of my very first projects was looking at the spring leaves that emerge on some trees that are bright red for a very short period and trying to understand the biological basis of that. But it started with observation. And the observation really led me to ask, what are the trees trying to share with us? And that's when I first think I started to listen to them in earnest, and it just grew from there.
In the introduction of the book, you visit James Island, South Carolina, home of the McLeod oak at McLeod Plantation. Why were you such a reluctant visitor, and how significant is the McLeod oak as a living witness?
So when I went to visit that former plantation with my sister and son, we were going because they wanted to visit. They are African American history buffs. And we always go and do some event that each person chooses. And so I really just thought about this as the site of a former plantation, thinking about former ancestors that would have been enslaved, and really felt what is described as land trauma, that going there, I was less concerned about my own exploration of the history, but not knowing who else would be there and whether they would be approaching it with the same seriousness and kind of gravity of weight that I felt. And so I was a little trepidatious about how the experience would go and if it would be an honoring of what I knew had happened there, which would have been traumatic for some of my formerly enslaved ancestors. And so I was really fighting with that. But when I got there, my son is such a thoughtful young man. He started to point out flowers and trees, hoping to pull out the plant and nature lover in me. And as we were walking around, I saw that McLeod oak, which is estimated to be as much as 600 years old. And it occurred to me then that it is, as you described, a living witness, that that same tree would have been standing there when people had been enslaved on that land. So I was fascinated with being able to be in the presence of the same being that they would have been, but then to realize that that tree would have witnessed their lives in joy, in sorrow, in all aspects of life, living as an enslaved person at that time. And so it really became a living bridge and a living witness to really experience that place from a kind of place-based spatial way. So I really thought about that tree and other century-old trees as real witnesses of lives of people who had lived long ago.
I love the title of your book. It represents the content so beautifully. When did you first conceive of the title, When Trees Testify? And can you share what it means to you?
With both the books I've written and projects I'm working on into the future, I often have the title before I've written hardly very much of anything. And I actually first encountered the McLeod oak when I was still working on my first book, Lessons from Plants. And as that book was coming out and I was invited to write about things I was thinking about, I wrote an article about the McLeod oak. And it's then that I started to realize that for me, even though I've just talked about it as a witness, I thought that it was doing more than witnessing. The distinction for me between witnessing and testifying is that witnesses observe something and carry that witness or observation of what they've experienced. But to testify is to go one step further in my mind. And so thinking about it kind of in a legal sense, witnesses come forward and testify. That is, they share what they witnessed in service to justice. And it felt like that was an appropriate kind of representation for what I hope to do in terms of braiding together plant science, African American history, and my family's own personal experience as African Americans in the South together in this book. So for me, testifying became a way of sharing a witness in hopes of it contributing to a sense of justice, even if that justice is just a accurate and full telling of American history.
In the book, each chapter features an important tree of the African American experience, starting with a pecan tree. How is the pecan tree linked to both the Native American and Black American culture and history?
Yes, I love that question because the pecan tree is both related in a larger American history, Native American history and Black American history, but also deeply rooted in my own personal family history growing up. People who lived in the Delta region of Arkansas, where pecan trees are very prevalent in the Southeast, over into New Mexico. And these trees do indeed have strong linkages to history of both Native American and Black American culture. Native Americans were using pecans as a source of food, as a source of currency in a way for trade, as well as using the products such as fermented drinks that were made from it in their own kind of sacred and cultural rituals long before anyone else was on the soils in North America. And so I wanted to acknowledge that long history and also to acknowledge a kind of distinct Black American cultural history with pecans in that our current pecan industry in the U.S. is actually rooted in a Black botanical discovery. An enslaved person named Antoine was a master horticulturalist and was tasked with grafting pecans so that you could get pecan trees that produced a very uniform nut of high quality with a lot of nut meat, which would be the basis of an agricultural industry. And so Native Americans have this long history in its natural uses, and this Black American botanical history sits at the juncture of pecan trees to be used for agricultural industry. So I was really excited to be able to explore both of those, as well as to highlight the way pecan shows up in multi-generations of my own family's history because of the trees and pecan growth that grew in the part of Arkansas where I am from.
Then you share the sycamore tree. Can you speak to the importance that trees such as the sycamore were to the Underground Railroad and freedom fighters on their path to freedom?
This is a really important variety of tree in a couple of ways linked to the question about having a role for Underground Railroad and freedom fighters. One of them is that the sycamore tree has a very distinctive bark. So its bark sloughs off that's very distinguishable in a forest stand. And so you can recognize sycamore trees quite readily, either in the daytime or also at night when the moon reflects off of the distinctive bark. And the fact that these trees are often found growing along riverbanks or the banks of other water bodies because they help stabilize the soil, being able to identify one would often lead you to water. And passage through water was a very important part of enslaved people seeking freedom because they would pass through the water to lose their scent in case hounds were being used to track them. So they're being able to recognize them spatially and often rooting them toward the body of water was very important. But the second property of these trees that was critically important for people pursuing freedom is that they often have hollowed out trunks. These are very large trees, and often the trunk gets hollowed out just in the natural life cycle of sycamore trees. And so they would often be used to either stow away and hide things as people were preparing to seek freedom, or sometimes they were large enough for individual and adult to hide in the trunk. So it's both their being able to be recognized, located next to water, but also the fact that they often could be used as a physical hiding place for goods needed to escape or for humans to hide during their escape. And so both of those critically important.
How would you describe the African American experience with nature, with the landscape, and is it still mostly a traumatic one?
Currently, it's a very rich experience that goes, like I hope the book goes, from ones that may be traumatic to ones that are full of joy. There are recent examples. About 5 or 6 years ago, the event that happened with Christian Cooper, a Black birder in New York City, when he was out birding in a park where he encountered a white woman and had a traumatic event when she weaponized the police against him. So there are times when it's still not quite safe to be out and about, but that's because of the nature of our country. But there are other times where people are out enjoying nature. I was just hearing a friend who's part of a Black Girl Runs Club where they get out and run. And so there's this whole gamut of Black people have always enjoyed nature like anyone else, and being able to celebrate that, but also recognizing that sometimes there's still not complete safety to be out and about just because of the nature of continued racism that exists in the country. And so I think it's not fully traumatic anymore. There's still the threat of trauma, but then there's also a lot of joy. So even after that event that I mentioned with Christian Cooper, there emerged Black Birders Week, which was a celebration that there are African Americans who love to bird and celebrating the joy of that, even as there may sometimes be trauma.
So as a Black botanist, you speak to the conflict that you say you often have between the physical and botanical beauty of plants and trees and the difficult aspects of the African American experience.
Yeah, so I think back to what we were talking about earlier. When I first encountered the McLeod oak, I was at first taken by its sheer beauty. It's massive, and I actually love to look at all the knots and bends of the trunks and branches of trees because it tells you a lot about that tree's history. And even as I started to recognize that it would have been there while people were enslaved there, then I started to think about some of the trauma that they experienced of the people being held captive. So it's that kind of thing. And then I also think back to a couple of years ago, I was visiting a site in Arkansas where my family is derived from. And as I was driving through, I saw white blowing across the highway. And when I looked across, there was a field of cotton. And cotton has a traumatic kind of presence in the past because of the way people were enslaved, even some of my own family. And yet when you watch cotton grow, to see the beauty of the flowers go from white to pink, and the magic that I think of that a plant can actually spin cotton. Sometimes with certain plants, there's both a beauty in terms of the physical presence and the biology that it's capable of, even while it's associated with a traumatic past in terms of how people had been enslaved to harvest crops or had engaged with trees in ways that might have led to lynching or other kinds of things. And so I'm constantly confronted with, I can recognize the beauty of the physical nature of plants and the biology, even if there may be a trauma associated with African American history in the U.S.
You speak of your personal connection to the willow tree and the Elaine massacre of 1919 and the desecration of the memorial willow trees over the years.
So the willow tree is actually one species that people might be surprised is included in the book. I mean, there's others that I think people would point to readily, poplar, oak, as trees that they would think of being associated with African Americans in the U.S. The willow tree was included because in 2019, I was working at Michigan State University in Michigan and saw a news story about a memorial willow tree that had been desecrated in Elaine, Arkansas. So as a plant lover derived from Arkansas, I see trees in Arkansas and get very fascinated. And this was commemorating an event that I was not fully aware of, which was a massacre that had occurred in Elaine, Arkansas in 1919. And I was fascinated by this because my grandfather was born in Elaine. I knew this. And as I started to think about how old he was born in 1914. So I called my mother just to say, I believe grandfather was born in Arkansas. How long did he live there? And she indicated that he had lived there for at least the first 8 or 9 years of his life. And so I realized that my grandfather would have been living as a 5-year-old in Elaine when this massacre happened in 1919. It's the largest anti-Black massacre on record in Arkansas. And the roots of it are that Black farmers were organizing to demand fair prices for cotton that they had raised. The union members were meeting at a church, and some white Arkansans came and something ensued. There's some controversy about who shot first, but ultimately it led to a massive influx of white Arkansans and white people from Mississippi and other places. And it's estimated that 200 to 800 Black Arkansans were killed in this massacre. So this is history that I had never wrapped my mind around, connected to a willow tree. And I find out that my grandfather was 5 years old when this happened and that he lived through it. That my grandmother and her twin would have been born the month before this massacre. So they would have been babies at the time. And so while my grandfather was old enough to have memories, my grandmother and her twin could have been impacted because they're being raised and nursed by a mother under very intense stress. So this was just an amazing family connection that many of us had not been aware of. My grandfather never talked about it. It was just fascinating to me that sitting in Michigan, my connection to Arkansas and a willow tree led me down this deep, deep, deep discovery of a family connection to a very tragic massacre that had happened in 1919 in Arkansas. A willow tree had been planted to commemorate the 100th anniversary of this in 2019. And after a few weeks of that tree being planted, it was cut down and the memorial placard was removed. And they had planted a willow tree because when the massacre happened, there had been a willow tree that was marking where many of the people who had been killed were buried, is what the story has been told by descendants. And so after that first memorial willow was desecrated in 2019, they planted another one, and that one was also desecrated. And so there was this idea that people were still grappling with not wanting to acknowledge the memory of that, and the willow tree became associated with that in that regard.
The poplar tree, so often represented in the arts and literature as the tree of lynchings and hangings, such as the song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Just how powerful is the memory that tree still communicates?
The poplar tree has become so deeply associated with lynching that I think even if you mention the name poplar tree, some people will know the association, even if they can't recognize what a poplar tree looked like. And this is because this song had really deeply resonated with people. And poplar trees were the site of lynching. The other trees were as well. But the person, a white Jewish man, actually wrote the lyrics of this song that became very popular when it was sung first by Billie Holiday. There was later a version by Nina Simone. And he had seen a picture of two African Americans hanging on a tree that caused him to write this song. He was so haunted by it. And so now there is this very deep association of strange fruit and lynching with the poplar tree. As I said, you can mention a poplar tree to some people, and they know that as the tree that stands for representing how many people, Black people, were murdered by hanging and lynching during enslavement, but also after enslavement in the U.S.
What are some of the untold and forgotten stories of African Americans who were deeply engaged with nature during the period of slavery? And how important is that African American botanical legacy?
There's so many stories that are untold or forgotten or little known. So the story I told earlier about Anton being the person who grafted the first commercial pecan trees, it has some people have talked about that. Taya Miles, the writer, talked about it in a book she had recently called All That She Carried. But there are other little known stories, right? There was an enslaved young African American who actually was responsible for helping develop vanilla. Even some of the stories that we know, people who we know like Harriet Tubman, a lot of her ability to be a freedom fighter and to lead people to freedom was because of her deep knowledge of nature and trees. And in the book, I explore a little known fact about Harriet Tubman having a great love for apple trees. So I think there are both names that we don't know or that are not well known, and then aspects of great knowledge of nature with even names that we know, like Harriet Tubman, that are at the root of their being very successful in terms of her ability to navigate people towards freedom. And so part of what I was hoping to achieve with When Trees Testify is for us to see the full gamut of how African Americans have contributed to agriculture. You know, in the book, I also talk about some of the ability people had to pursue freedom was based, again, on what we were talking about earlier, their understanding of what to look for in terms of sycamore. Or also, I think we'll talk a little bit about apple and founding of free Black towns. And so there are all these ways in which botanical knowledge contributed to the agricultural industry in the U.S. I think about the African American women who were brought from parts of West Africa and enslaved here because of their knowledge about growing rice and irrigating rice. And so there's this deep well of botanical expertise that I hope we don't lose when we think about that time and think about the trauma of enslavement. As a Black person who is working in the plant scientist, I also want to understand that I'm part of a legacy of expertise and knowledge that has contributed to advancement of certain areas like agriculture.
And then there's the oak tree. What role do oak trees, such as the emancipation oak or the angel oak, play in testifying to the forgotten Black history that is just now being told?
The lovely part is that both are still standing, and you can go and physically be with those trees. The emancipation oak, which is found in Virginia, I saw it on the campus of Hampton, Virginia, the site where the Emancipation Proclamation was first read to a group of Black people in that area. But it was also a site where a woman was teaching classes to the children of people who were either enslaved or had been freed. It was a site where the community was coming together for education. So it was a gathering site. Angel oak, it's one of the trees on the top 10 that I hope people get to see. It's just a massive tree. That's about half the size of a football field, and it's resident to resurrection ferns, which when it's wet enough are just in all of their splendor. The Angel Oak was a site that Septima Clark to take her classes. It was one of the few spaces that was integrated and Black people could go there and visit. Septima Clark was someone who did a lot of teaching, including mentoring Rosa Parks and working with Martin Luther King Jr. And so there are these trees that have deep connections to critical moments, like the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, or a site where a civil rights activist was doing some of her justice work with her classes when she was a teacher. I think that there are the areas that really do serve as physical sites for us to think about individuals who were critical to African American history, the pursuit of full freedom from African Americans in the U.S., which I argue is a critical part of American history.
In the book, you talk about your visit to Blackdom, New Mexico, and how apple trees are a core part of the African American legacy of freedom.
I didn't know when I first started writing When Trees Testify that it'd be part travelogue, but it became important for me to share my experience of engaging in some of these spaces. So I learned about Blackdom, New Mexico from a friend, Maya Shamshin-Dean, who's also an African-American woman in the plant sciences who's from New Mexico. And she shared with me and several of us how there was a town, Blackdom, New Mexico, that was founded in the early 1900s, like about 1903 or so. Francis Boyer was one of the founders. Francis and Ella, his wife, were two of the founders. And these were individuals who had been living in Georgia and regions of the U.S. that were actively in Jim Crow, where Black people's movement and freedoms were limited by laws. And at that time, New Mexico did not have Jim Crow laws. So some of these individuals decided that they would move and start a free Black town. This was the first Black settlement in New Mexico, where they would be free to live and thrive, free of Jim Crow laws. And part of their moving to the desert, they would need to grow their own food and have ways to make money. So they actually advertised that they wanted people amongst those who would help found the town who had agricultural expertise. And part of the first crops that they grew, one of them were apple trees in the desert. And they were able to do this because of knowledge that some of the people came with about dry farming and how to get plants to grow in areas with proper irrigation, like the desert. Having grown up in Arkansas, the natural state, very similar to Georgia, rich soil, very green, I was fascinated that people would leave the fertility of those areas to move to the desert and how much the pursuit for freedom must be driving them for them to do that. There's nothing really left of the town. There's a site marker and some vestiges. They were so successful growing apple trees that they grew enough for themselves to eat, but also Frank and his son were able to use them as a commercial industry where they would raise enough money to help support their life there. So for me, apple trees were a core part of the successful pursuit of freedom. And Blackdom is just one such town. There are others across the U.S. where Black people did move. Many of them, the people had agricultural expertise to allow them to have success with establishing those towns that they were pursuing their own freedom.
So in closing, what do you hope readers will take with them after reading When Trees Testify?
It's my hope that people will look at trees differently when they interact with them, and hope that people will take a deeper appreciation for the depths of contributions that African Americans have made to agriculture, and that there is a rich experience of African Americans in this country that certainly has some trauma because people were brought here against their will and enslaved. But beyond that trauma, they continue to experience joy. They continue to contribute their expertise. And it's my hope that instead of walking away from parts of our history, we will embrace a full history of what the contribution that African Americans were, even as we understand that there was trauma. So that is my hope, that we may rethink what the full experience of African Americans have been in the U.S., to celebrate African American history and understand that in so doing, we're celebrating a richer history of the United States as a whole.
enjoyed this episode with Beronda Montgomery. And I hope you take the opportunity to read this wonderful book, When Trees Testify: Science, Wisdom, History, and America's Black Botanical Legacy. You can learn more about Beronda, the author, the botanist, and the scientist at her website, BerondaMontgomery.com. If you enjoyed this episode of Nature Revisited, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website, nortonproductions.com. And please share your comments and suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for this episode is The Machine in the Garden by Ben Cosgrove from his album, The Trouble with Wilderness. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.